Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly beneath the cold black surface of the North Atlantic into the cramped, diesel-soaked world of a German U-boat in 1941. Not the heroic poster version, the real one. 50 men, one steel tube, and the smell of sweat, salt, and damp wool. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. Think of that little notification bell as a good night reminder, a soft signal that another long, slow story is waiting for you the next time the world feels too loud. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I genuinely love reading them, even at 3 in the morning. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan, pull your blanket up, get comfortable. You will be far drier and far warmer than any U-boat man ever was, which, honestly, is the easiest bar history has ever set. Adjust the pillow. Let your shoulders sink into the mattress. Take 3 slow breaths in and 3 slow breaths out. You don't need to follow every detail tonight. My voice will stay soft and steady. No jarring noises, no sudden swells. If you drift off in the first 10 minutes, that's a win. So let us slip beneath the surface together. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it really felt like to live for 2 months inside a metal pipe 67 meters long, sealed away from sun and stars and rain? Have you ever thought about what your body would do, what your mind would do, after weeks of breathing the same recycled air as 49 other men? What did that air actually taste like 3 weeks down, when the carbon dioxide thickened and the light bulbs began to dim, and every breath felt like sipping warm soup through a wool sock? What did the bread smell like by week 4, when the green fuzz had to be sliced away with a kitchen knife before the cook could serve it? What did the sheets feel like when you crawled into a bunk still warm and damp from the man who had just left it, his sweat soaking quietly into yours? How did boys barely out of school stay calm when the depth charges began to fall, when the rivets swept seawater and the lights shattered and the hull rang like a struck bell? How did they fill the long, empty hours between attacks, when the hydrophone heard nothing but distant wails and the slow churn of a convoy still over the horizon? How did they stay clean, write letters home, fall a little in love with a photograph pinned above a torpedo? What did Karl Dönitz really mean when he called these young men his grey wolves? And why did 3 out of every 4 of them never come home? And perhaps the strangest question of all, how did the survivors return in the end to a Germany that no longer existed? Don't worry, we'll wander gently through every one of these questions tonight. You are in good hands. You can let your eyes close whenever they want to. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1941. It's a grey autumn morning in Lorient, on the coast of occupied France, and the air smells of coal smoke, Atlantic salt, and the faint sharp tang of diesel drifting from the long, low grey boat tied up beside the concrete bunker. Sailors in white-topped caps are loading sausages, loaves of black bread, and slim, oily torpedoes that look far too polite to do what they were built for. A military band is playing a slow march somewhere behind you, slightly out of tune, as if even the trumpets are tired. You are a young matrose. Your sea bag is on your shoulder. The gangplank is waiting. 60 days at sea ahead of you. Good luck. Before you step onto that gangplank, though, let me hold you here on the quay for just a moment longer, because you cannot really understand the boy with the sea bag or the boat he is about to vanish into without first understanding how any of this came to exist at all. The story of the U-boat arm did not begin in 1941. It began almost 30 years earlier, in another war, in another century, when submarines were still considered slightly disreputable, the kind of weapon a gentleman might use, but only if no one was watching. Picture, then, a different cold morning. This one in September of 1914 off the Dutch coast. A small German submarine called U-9, commanded by a quiet, careful officer named Otto Weddigen, surfaces just enough to peer through her periscope at 3 British armoured cruisers patrolling lazily in line. Aboukir, Hogue and Cressy. Big, proud, slightly outdated ships, full of reservists and very young midshipmen. In the space of about an hour on the 22nd of September 1914, Weddigen torpedoes all 3. Around 1,450 British sailors die in the cold grey water. The world is shocked, genuinely shocked, in a way it would only be shocked once or twice more in the new century. Submarines, it turns out, are not disreputable. Submarines are catastrophic. From that single morning, the German submarine arm grew into something the Imperial Navy had not really planned for. By 1917, in a fit of strategic desperation, Berlin declared unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning U-boats would sink any ship, neutral or not, on sight. They very nearly starved Britain into surrender. They also dragged a still sleepy United States into the war, which, as strategic gambles go, turned out to be the kind of gamble that ends empires. By November 1918, the empire was indeed ending. The Imperial High Seas Fleet, ordered to a final suicidal sortie, mutinied instead, hoisted red flags, and sailed quietly into internment at Scapa Flow in the cold green water of the Orkney Islands. There, in June of 1919, rather than hand their ships over to the British, German crews opened the seacocks and quietly scuttled the entire fleet. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all of it, sliding to the bottom in a slow, defiant gurgle. It was the largest single act of naval suicide in history, and somehow also one of the most German things ever done. The Treaty of Versailles, signed that same summer, then forbade Germany from owning submarines at all. No U-boats, ever, full stop, which is a very firm rule, and also the kind of rule that, historically, has worked out about as well as telling a cat not to climb the curtains. Because the German Navy, now reduced to a sad little coastal force called the Reichsmarine, simply could not bear to let all that hard-earned submarine knowledge die. So, very quietly, in 1922, they helped set up a small engineering office in The Hague, in the neutral Netherlands, called Ingenieurskantoor voor Scheepsbouw, or EVS for short. On paper, it designed submarines for export. For Finland, for Turkey, for Spain. Lovely, peaceful submarines for lovely, peaceful little nations. In reality, every blueprint, every welding technique, every torpedo tube design was a quiet rehearsal. German engineers travelled discreetly to Finnish shipyards to test the boats they were forbidden from owning at home. It was, genuinely, one of the most patient and successful pieces of military cheating in modern history. Then came 1933, and a new government in Berlin that had even fewer reservations about international agreements. By the 18th of June 1935, in one of the stranger diplomatic arrangements of the interwar years, Britain herself signed a naval agreement permitting Germany to build submarines again, up to 45% of the Royal Navy's total tonnage. The British thought they were managing the problem. They were, in fact, opening a door they would spend the next 10 years desperately trying to close. And waiting on the other side of that door was a thin, intense, slightly weary-looking man named Karl Dönitz. Dönitz had been born in 1891 in a small town outside Berlin, the son of an engineer. He had served in the First World War as a young U-boat officer aboard UB-68 until his boat suffered a mechanical failure in the Mediterranean, broke surface in the middle of a British convoy, and was promptly sunk under him. He was fished out of the water and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner in a camp near Sheffield, where, by his own later account, he passed the long, damp evenings, thinking quite a lot about how, if you only had enough submarines and you used them together, in groups, at night, on the surface, you could probably destroy any convoy in the world. Most prisoners pass the time daydreaming about home, or food, or the women they hope are still waiting. Dönitz daydreamed about wolf packs, which tells you almost everything you need to know about him. Released in 1919, he stayed in the tiny post-war Navy through the long flat years, surfacing again in 1935 when he was appointed Führer der U-Boote, commander of the new submarine arm. He was 44 years old. He had a small, neat office, almost no boats, and a head full of ideas that nobody in higher command particularly wanted to hear. His men, however, adored him. They called him Der Löwe, the lion, because of the way he stalked the quayside when boats came home. They also called him Uncle Karl, because he genuinely remembered their names, asked after their mothers, attended their weddings when he could, and read every patrol report personally, every single one, scribbling notes in the margins in his tight schoolmaster's handwriting. He was austere, devoted, occasionally fanatical, almost monkish in his discipline. He drank little. He smoked less. He believed in his men with the kind of certainty that in a more peaceful century would have made him a very good headmaster. His doctrine had a name, Rudeltaktik, Wolfpack Tactics. The idea was simple and, in 1935, quietly revolutionary. You spread a long line of submarines across a likely convoy route. The first boat to spot the convoy did not attack alone. It became the Fühlungshalter, the contact keeper, shadowing just over the horizon and radioing position reports back to a central headquarters. That headquarters, eventually a quiet villa called Carnival near Lorient, would then vector other boats to converge. And on a moonless night, half a dozen U-boats would slip in on the surface, where their low grey silhouettes were nearly invisible, and where their diesel engines, ironically, made them faster than the corvettes hunting them. They would not even bother to dive. They would shoot from inside the convoy itself. It was an elegant theory. It was also, in 1939, almost entirely theoretical, because when war broke out on the 1st of September that year, Dönitz had exactly 57 U-boats. Of those, only about 22 were genuinely ocean-going, the long-range Type VIIs and the bigger Type IXs. The rest were small coastal boats, the kind of vessels suitable for poking around the Baltic and not much else. He had asked Hitler for 300. He had been given 57. As beginnings go, it was less a wolf pack and more a slightly anxious litter. But what he did have, in abundance, was young men. Oh, the young men. Tens of thousands of them, eventually. The U-boat arm was, from beginning to end, an entirely volunteer service, the Freiwilligenmeldung, which meant that every boy who climbed down a U-boat hatch had, at some point, raised his hand and asked specifically to be there. Imagine that. Imagine raising your hand for that. The average crewman was 20 to 22 years old. The captains, the men with the gold-edged white caps and the staggering responsibility for 50 other lives, were often only 25 to 28. There were boys aboard those boats who had never voted, never lived alone, never kissed anyone, going to sea for 60 days at a time with the power to sink ships full of people they would never see. The appeal, on paper, was real. Double pay, special rations including chocolate, real coffee, citrus fruit, and, when in port, almost unlimited beer. The right to wear the Mütze, the white-topped cap, which, in the small theatrical economy of a wartime German town, was as good as a knighthood. Then there was Dönitz himself, his growing legend, the propaganda films like U-Boot Westwards of 1941, with their rolling Atlantic seas and their square-jawed heroes and their swelling brass bands. To a 17-year-old apprentice in Hamburg, watching that film in a smoky cinema with his girlfriend's hand in his, the U-boat arm looked like an answer to almost every question adolescents had ever asked him. And the social mix that resulted was strange and, in its own way, oddly beautiful. Working-class boys from the Hamburg docks, Bremen warehousemen, Bavarian farm sons, all crammed into the same steel tube as the polite, slightly bewildered second sons of Prussian officer families, the boys whose grandfathers had fought at Sedan and whose fathers had died at Verdun. Once the hatch closed, none of that mattered very much. The bunk you climbed into was the bunk you climbed into. The sweat soaking the sheet was just sweat. Class, in an iron tube 200 meters down, has the curious habit of dissolving rather quickly. Politically, the picture was more mixed than the post-war legend allowed. Some officers were committed Nazis, true believers in the regime. Many more were apolitical patriots of the older, stiff-collared sort, men who would have served any German government because it was a German government, and who, in the privacy of their own minds, found the brown shirts and the rallies a little vulgar. The crew, the ordinary boys, were mostly just boys. They had been raised in the Hitler Youth because everyone had been raised in the Hitler Youth. They sang the songs because everyone sang the songs. Their politics, such as they were, mostly amounted to wanting to do well, to make their fathers proud, and to come home alive. Most of them would not. That is the quiet, terrible fact that hangs over every recruitment poster, every smiling photograph, every cheerful letter home from those first eager months of training. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm during the Second World War, nearly 30,000 would die. Another 5,000 would become prisoners of war. The casualty rate in the end would be around 75%. In all the long catalogue of military horrors of the 20th century, very few branches of any service in any country suffered worse. But none of them know that yet. Not in 1936, not in 1938, not even, really, in the first warm flush of 1940. They are still standing in cold Baltic wind on the parade ground at Flensburg-Mürwik, or sitting in a chalk-smelling classroom in Kiel learning the parts of a diesel engine, or staring up at a recruitment poster in a Hamburg tram station. The sailor on it gazing nobly into a stormy sky, the slogan promising adventure and brotherhood, and the chance to be someone, finally, instead of nobody. They raise their hands, they sign their names, they walk one by one toward the boats. And before any of them can reach a real U-boat, slick and oily and tied up at a French quay, they have to be taught how not to drown in one. Which is the part of the U-boat story almost nobody tells, because nobody ever made a film about it. There are no swelling brass bands for diesel maintenance class. There are no recruitment posters showing a young man learning how to seal a leaking valve while standing waist-deep in cold seawater inside a concrete tank. And yet, before any of these eager boys ever saw a real Atlantic, they spent the better part of a year being slowly, patiently, sometimes brutally, taught the long, unglamorous craft of not dying inside a metal tube. It began with Grundausbildung, basic naval training in places like Stralsund or Plön or Wesermünde, towns where the Baltic wind has the personality of an irritated schoolmistress, and where the parade ground smelled, depending on the season, of wet wool, boot polish, and slightly sour soup. Here, for the first 3 months, the boys did what young soldiers have done in every army since the dawn of time. They marched. They polished things. They marched while polishing things. They learned knots, signal flags, the pieces of a rifle, the proper way to fold a hammock, the words to a great many cheerful naval songs about how splendid it was to die for one's country. They were shouted at by petty officers who had themselves been shouted at, almost certainly by the same petty officers in the previous war. The food was bad and the beds were narrow, and most of them, in their letters home, said that it was the best time of their lives, which is the kind of thing only a boy of 19 could possibly say with a straight face. Once that was done, the truly interesting part began. The promising volunteers were sent to the U-Bootschule, the submarine school, originally at Neustadt, later expanded to Pillau on the Baltic coast, and to Gotenhafen, today the Polish city of Gdynia. Here, for another 3 to 6 months, they began the real work. They sat in chalk-smelling classrooms learning diving theory, the physics of buoyancy, the trim system, the relationship between depth and pressure that turned a steel hull into a slow accordion the deeper you went. They learned the inner anatomy of a torpedo, the gyro angle, the depth-keeping mechanism, the magnetic and contact pistols. They learned diesel mechanics by climbing inside the engines themselves, their hands black with oil for weeks at a time. They learned the mysterious little world of the electric motors, the giant lead-acid batteries that filled the deck plating beneath their feet, the careful art of charging and discharging without making the boat smell quite so strongly of hydrogen that a single spark would turn everyone aboard into an interesting modern sculpture. They learned hydrophone listening, which is a stranger skill than it sounds. The hydrophone operator, the funkmart with the headphones pressed to his ears in his tiny curtained alcove, was expected to identify, by sound alone, the difference between a destroyer's screws and a freighter's, between a corvette and a tanker, between a school of dolphins and an approaching torpedo. The good ones could tell you the convoy's bearing, its rough speed, the number of escorts, sometimes even the type of merchant ship, all from the soft, watery thrumming in his ears. It was a kind of underwater wine tasting, with higher stakes, and then they learned damage control, which is where the romance began to fade, and the reality began, very firmly, to set in. At a place called the Agru Front, the frontline training group based near Hela on the Baltic coast, the final brutal stage of training took place. Here, in mock-up compartments and in real boats run by veteran instructors, the trainees were put through scenarios designed to be as close to dying as you could get without actually doing so. Compartments were flooded deliberately while they fought to seal the leaks. Smoke generators filled the boat with thick, acrid fog while they groped for breathing apparatus in the dark. Mock depth charges were detonated nearby in the water to teach them what it would feel like, more or less, when the real ones came. Boats were taken to crash dive depth again and again, the alarm bells screaming, men sliding down the slick deck plates as the bow tilted 30 degrees down, every face wet with sweat and seawater, and a little bit of fear that even the instructors could not entirely shame out of them. The Agru front existed for one reason. Dönitz had decided, very early, that he could not afford crews who panicked. A panicking crew on a U-boat does not lose a battle. It loses the boat. It loses everyone. So the Agru front broke them, very carefully, until panic was something that happened to other people in other navies. By the time a crew finished there, they had been together for months. They had eaten the same bad sausage, breathed the same diesel fumes, fallen into the same cold water, sworn at the same instructors, slept in the same overcrowded barracks. And now, finally, they were sent forward to a real boat. Which brings us gently to the boats themselves. Because to understand what it really meant to live in one of these things, you have to picture it. The workhorse, the boat that did the bulk of the killing and the bulk of the dying, was the Type VII C. About 67 meters long, which is to say roughly the length of a city block. 6 meters wide at the widest, which is to say a little less than a school bus. Surfaced displacement of 769 tons. A crew, depending on the patrol, of 44 to 52 men. Twin-man diesel engines on the surface, capable of pushing the boat to about 17 knots. 2 electric motors for submerged running, good for about 7.5 knots flat out, though that drained the batteries within an hour. Range, on the surface, at economical speed, about 8,500 nautical miles, which sounds like a great deal until you remember that the Atlantic is wide, and a convoy can run away from you for days. Then there was the Type IX, longer and sleeker, with a range of nearly 11,000 nautical miles, the boat for distant patrols, for the American coast, for West Africa, for, eventually, the warm, strange waters of the Indian Ocean. Bigger crew, bigger fuel tanks, slightly more comfortable, in the way that a slightly larger coffin is slightly more comfortable. There were, occasionally, the rare and exotic Type 14, called the Milchkuh, the milk cow, a fat, round supply submarine designed to refuel and resupply combat boats far out at sea. The Allies hunted them with particular enthusiasm, because each one killed shortened the range of the entire fleet. Nearly all of them were sunk. And then, much later, almost too late to matter, there was the Type 21 electroboot, the dream boat, the one that, if it had arrived 2 years earlier, might genuinely have changed everything. It is a boat we will return to in the long, sad final chapter of this story. Now imagine yourself, finally, climbing down through the conning tower hatch of a Type VII C and standing at the top of the steel ladder. The smell hits you before anything else. Diesel and old food and the chemical sweetness of lead-acid batteries and the deep, lived-in funk of 48 men who have not had a real bath in 6 weeks. Your eyes adjust. The lighting is bright incandescent white in most compartments, with a switch to red bulbs before night surfacing to preserve night vision. Pipes everywhere, painted in coded colors. Valves, gauges, wheels, brass fittings worn shiny from 1,000 hands. Walk forward and you find the bow torpedo room, where 4 torpedo tubes wait quietly behind their inner doors, and where reload torpedoes lie in racks like enormous metal sausages, and where, slung between those torpedoes in canvas hammocks, the junior crew sleep. Yes, sleep, on top of 1.5 tons of high explosive each. Apparently they got used to it. Walk aft, past the petty officers' quarters with their slightly more permanent bunks, past the captain's tiny curtained nook, the only space on the entire boat with anything resembling privacy, just a narrow bunk, a small fold-down desk, a green curtain. Past the radio room, where the operator hunched over his receiver, and the sound room, where the hydrophone man pressed his headphones to his ears for hours at a time. Into the Zentrale, the central control room, directly beneath the conning tower, where the helmsman stood at the planes, where the navigator hunched over his charts, where the chief engineer, the LI, watched a wall of dials, and quietly in his head kept the entire boat balanced. Above the Zentrale, up a short ladder, the conning tower itself, with the attack periscope and the surface bearing finder called the UZO, and the torpedo data computer, the Vorhaltrechner, that translated bearings and ranges into firing solutions, the captain's nest, the place where, when the bell rang, the war happened. Aft of the Zentrale, the galley, no bigger than a phone booth, where the cook, the smutje, somehow produced 2 hot meals a day for 50 men, often while the boat rolled 40 degrees in heavy seas. Then the diesel room, with its 2 MAN engines, hot, loud, oily, the place where, on the surface, no human conversation was possible. Then the electric motor room. Then, finally, the aft torpedo room, with its single stern tube and a few more reload torpedoes, and a few more hammocks slung between them. And here is the detail that perhaps tells you the most about life on a Type VII C. There were, in total, about 30 actual bunks for 50 men, which meant that bunks were shared in a system universally called warm's bed, the warm bed, or more cheerfully, hot bunking. When you came off your 4-hour watch, exhausted, soaked, half frozen, you crawled into a bunk that another man had just climbed out of, still warm with his body heat, still damp with his sweat. You fell asleep in a stranger's smell. 8 hours later, you climbed out and the next man climbed in, and the cycle went on for 60 days. There was, on the entire boat, 1 functioning toilet. The other one, in port, had typically been packed full of food supplies because the cook needed the storage space more than the crew needed the relief. Operating that 1 toilet was a complicated procedure of valves and pressure equalization, and getting it wrong, especially at depth, could blow sewage back into the boat under enormous pressure. Or worse. We will return, in due time, to the strange story of U-1206, the boat that was actually lost in 1945 because of a toilet. Yes, genuinely. There was a snorkel system, the Schnorkel, fitted from 1944 onward, that allowed the diesels to run while submerged at periscope depth, and we will come to the misery of that too. There was the saddle ballast, the trim tanks, the compressed air banks, 1,000 systems, each of which, if it failed at the wrong moment, could kill everyone aboard. And on top of all of that, somewhere in occupied France, this boat was waiting for them. The trainees boarded their long troop trains in Kiel or Wilhelmshaven, rattled south through Germany, west through Belgium, into the cold grey light of Brittany, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, La Pallice, Bordeaux, the 5 great Atlantic bases, each with its enormous concrete bunker complex, the famous Keroman pens at Lorient, with their roofs over 7 meters thick, designed to shrug off any bomb the Royal Air Force could yet drop. And there, finally, they would step aboard for real. Onto a war-worn boat, its hull patched with welded plates from the last patrol's depth charges, its conning tower stained with salt and oil, the lingering smell of the previous crew's unwashed laundry still clinging to the bunks. The veteran sailors would look the new boys over, very carefully, with the unsmiling kindness of men who already knew which of them was likely to come home. And someone, almost always, would crack the same old grim joke about how the Iron Cross came in 3 grades, with swords, with oak leaves, and with a wooden box. Which was usually the moment the new boys realized they had, in fact, raised their hands rather a long way. So picture yourself, then, on one of those boats, not in training, not at the dock, at sea, real sea, North Atlantic Sea, in the middle of the night, somewhere west of Ireland in the autumn of 1941. It is a little after midnight. The boat is running on the surface in heavy weather because almost everything important happened on the surface in those years. Below you, the diesels are hammering away in their hot, oily room. 2 man engines pushing the boat through swells that come in sets of 3 and lift the bow with the patient, indifferent strength of something that has been doing this since before there were people. Up on the bridge, 4 lookouts and the officer of the watch are lashed to the railing with leather harnesses, because if you were not, the sea would, sooner or later, simply lift you off and take you. They are wearing oilskins over wool, over more wool, and it is not enough. The spray comes over the conning tower in long horizontal sheets, and it is so cold it does not feel like water. It feels like being slapped with handfuls of broken glass. Each man has a quarter of the horizon. Forward port, forward starboard, aft port, aft starboard. They sweep their sectors with Zeiss 7x50 binoculars, the standard issue, the same binoculars their grandsons will still be using to watch birds. Their job is to see things. Smoke, a masthead, a faint white line that might be a wake, a black shape against a slightly less black sky. Their eyes water in the wind until the tears freeze on their lashes, and they keep sweeping because the man who sees first lives. Below them, through the open hatch, the boat exhales its strange warm breath. And this is where you go now, down the ladder into the smell. Because the smell is the thing every survivor remembered first. Diesel, of course. The diesel is everywhere, in your hair, in your sheets, in the bread, in the chocolate, drawn down from the bridge in a constant warm draft. Underneath the diesel, body odor, 50 men in wool clothes that have not been washed in weeks, sweating in shifts. Underneath the body odor, urine, because the toilet is occupied or broken or terrifying, and a bucket has appeared, and no one talks about the bucket. Underneath the urine, mildew, because everything fabric is permanently damp and nothing ever dries. And underneath the mildew, the strange sweet rot of food going slowly bad, especially the bread, which after about 10 days at sea began to bloom with a soft green fur, and which the crew, with the terrible tenderness of men who name everything they are afraid of, called Hundekuchen. Dog biscuit. You sliced it, scraped the green off with your knife, and ate the inside, and tried not to think about what the rest of the loaf might be doing inside you. The light, when you reach the bottom of the ladder, is bright. Bright, incandescent white bulbs in compartments painted glossy white, because in the dim hours of a long submerged day, white paint and bright lights were the only things standing between 50 men and a creeping kind of madness. Before night surfacing, the lights would be switched to red, deep red, dim red, so that the bridge watch climbing up the ladder would already have their night vision adjusted before the hatch opened above them. There is something about a U-boat in red light that survivors describe in almost religious terms. The boat became a long, glowing, ruby-colored cave, and the men inside it became, for a moment, something other than themselves. The sound is the next thing. The diesels are a heartbeat you feel in your sternum. The ventilation fans whir constantly, moving the foul air around without ever really cleaning it. Water sloshes in the bilges with each roll of the boat, a wet metallic chuckle that never stops. The pressure hull creaks. Pipes tick as they expand and contract. Someone, somewhere, is always snoring, and someone else is always coughing, and from the galley comes the soft clink of a pot lid being lifted and put down again. Which brings us to the galley, which is technically a galley in the way that a closet is technically a bedroom. It is smaller than a phone booth. It contains a tiny stove, a tiny sink, and a man called the smutier, the cook, who has somehow signed up for the Wehrmacht's most absurd job. From this space, the size of a confessional, the smutier produced, for 50 men, 2 hot meals a day, every day, for 60 straight days, while the floor pitched at random angles up to 40 degrees, and pots leapt off burners with the cheerful disobedience of small animals. In the first week of a patrol, the food was, by wartime standards, astonishing. Fresh meat hung from pipes in the corridors, loaves of real bread, onions, potatoes, cabbages, even sometimes fresh eggs and bananas, the bananas swinging gently from overhead pipes like a strange tropical decoration in a steel cave. There were oranges and lemons issued against scurvy. Real coffee, which was carefully hoarded and brewed only on combat days or birthdays, because real coffee in 1941, Germany was a kind of love letter from the High Command. There was butter, real butter. There was chocolate, the famous Coca-Cola tin with its caffeine kick. By the third week, that was all gone. The bread was furred green. The butter wept rancid yellow tears in its tin. The sausages had begun to perspire in a way that no sausage should. The cabbages collapsed into wet brown puddles. From here on out, you ate Dauerbrot, the canned bread, dense and sour. You ate pea soup so often you began to dream about it. You ate sauerkraut from cans and blood sausage that had given up trying to be food and had decided to be character development. You drank powdered milk reconstituted with stale water. You ate, in short, what you could, and you did not complain, because the smutier was working miracles in his confessional, and you knew it. And then there was the bathroom situation, which we have gently been avoiding. There was, on the entire Type VII C, one functioning toilet. The other one, as mentioned, was usually packed solid with hams and tinned bread for the first month of the patrol, because the cook needed storage and the men, in theory, could wait. To use the one functioning toilet, you opened a series of valves in a specific order, performed your business with as much dignity as 50 unwashed strangers and a single thin door allowed, and then operated a complicated pressure equalization system to expel the waste against the pressure of the sea outside. Get the order wrong, especially at depth, and the sea would, with the unbothered force of physics, push everything back at you into the boat under high pressure. This is, indeed, what happened to U-1206 in April of 1945 off the coast of Scotland, when a malfunctioning toilet flooded the battery compartment, generated chlorine gas, and forced the boat to surface, where it was promptly attacked and lost. Yes, a submarine, sunk by its own toilet. Sleep on that one for a moment. Hygiene, more broadly, was a quiet catastrophe. There was no fresh water for washing, only saltwater soap, Meerwasserseif, which was scientifically proven to neither lather nor clean, but which the men used anyway in a kind of theatrical performance of cleanliness. Beards were not encouraged. Beards simply happened. The Atlantic Bart, the Atlantic beard, became the unofficial badge of the long patrol, growing day by day until the men returning to Lorient looked less like sailors and more like a mountain rescue team made of damp prophets. There were lice. There were salt sores where the wool rubbed wet skin. There were strange fungal blooms in places. Fungal blooms had no business being. There were boils. The medical officer, if there was one, dispensed iodine and aspirin and small quiet talks. The watch system was 4 hours on, 8 hours off, 3 watches rotating through the long days. In your 8 hours off, you were supposed to sleep, eat, and somehow be a person. Eating happened on a tiny folding table in the bow torpedo room, balanced between reload torpedoes, with men eating in shifts, because the table sat only a handful at a time. Sleeping happened in the warm bed, the hot bunk, the still damp sheets of whichever stranger had just climbed out. And being a person happened in the strange small rituals that 50 men, sealed in a tube, somehow always invented. There was the wind-up gramophone. There were perhaps a dozen records. Some boats played the same record again and again and again, until even the man who loved it began to twitch when it started. Lael Anderson's Lily Marlang was on almost every boat, the soft, mournful voice drifting through the diesel haze like a ghost. Zara Leander, the Swedish chanteuse with the smoky, low voice, was on most. Jazz, officially banned by the regime as degenerate music, was somehow on a great many of them too, smuggled aboard in plain sleeves and played with the volume low and a kind of conspiratorial smile. There were dog-eared paperback copies of Karl May westerns passed from bunk to bunk until the pages turned soft as cloth. The boys reading about cowboys and Apache warriors while sliding through the cold green dark of the Atlantic. There was chess. There was scat, the German national card game, played with a relentless religious intensity for tiny stakes that, by week 6, represented the redistribution of the entire boat's wealth. There were letters home, written and rewritten, knowing they would not be sent for weeks, knowing that the censor would read them, knowing that the woman or mother or sister at the other end would not get them until the boat had been away so long it might already have stopped existing. There were rituals. When a boat crossed the equator, there was a full ceremony with King Neptune played by the burliest petty officer, and the new boys ducked in barrels of slimy water and dressed in seaweed and made to swear oaths to the old gods of the sea. When it was a man's birthday, the smutje somehow produced a small cake, sometimes baked in a tin set against the diesel exhaust manifold, where the heat was steady and the smell of diesel gave the cake a flavour that survivors remembered, decades later, with a kind of affection no normal person would ever feel for a diesel-flavoured cake. The captain, on most boats, made a quiet evening round, stopping at each station, asking each man how he was, calling him by name. On a good boat, with a good captain, this small thing held the entire crew together. And underneath all of it, the gallows humour. Always the gallows humour. The men joked when their commendations came in that the Iron Cross now came in 3 grades, with swords, with oak leaves, and with a wooden box. Eisernes Kreuz mit Eichenlaub und Holzkiste. They told the joke again and again, and laughed at it again and again, because the only way to live with a thing is sometimes to name it, out loud, in front of your friends, and watch it become a little smaller. The boat rolled on through another midnight. Another watch came down the ladder, soaked and frozen and grateful for the warmth. Another watch climbed up, harnessing themselves into the wind. In the galley, the smutier was already brewing the next pot of coffee, the smell threading its slow, warm way through the diesel and the sweat and the mildew, reaching every bunk in the long steel tube, telling 50 young men, in the only language that mattered out here, that they were, for now, still alive. Still alive. And, in those first 2 years of the war, often winning. Because we have been moving slowly, sensorily, through the inside of the steel tube, but to understand why these young men joined at all, why they kept volunteering even as the war ground on, we have to step back out of the diesel haze for a little while and look at the years when the U-boat arm was, genuinely, the most feared weapon in the Atlantic, and the men who crewed it walked down the gangplanks of Lorient and Saint-Nazaire to brass bands and flowers and the personal handshake of Karl Dönitz himself. The U-boat men called it Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. And in retrospect, there is something almost unbearable about that name, given how it ended. But in the autumn of 1940 and into the spring of 1941, it was the truth of their daily experience. They were sinking ships faster than the British could replace them. They were doing it with very few boats, very little technology, and a great deal of nerve. And they were, for a brief, dazzling moment, becoming the most famous young men in Germany. It had not started that way. The very first shot of the war at sea was, in fact, a disaster. On the 3rd of September 1939, only hours after Britain declared war on Germany, U-30, under the command of Fritz Julius Lemp, spotted a darkened ship steaming a zigzag course off the Hebrides. Lemp, applying the rules of unrestricted submarine warfare he believed were already in force, fired without warning. The ship was the SS Athenia, a passenger liner full of civilians, including women, children and Americans fleeing the war. 117 people died. Berlin, horrified at the diplomatic catastrophe, denied it for years, blamed the British, doctored U-30's logbook, and quietly hoped no one would notice. Lemp, for his part, kept fighting. He would meet his end 2 years later in a way that would change the course of the entire war. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The first true hero of the U-boat arm arrived a few weeks later, in October of 1939, and his name was Günther Prien. Prien was a 31-year-old former merchant officer, sharp-eyed, ambitious, with the kind of cool confidence that submarine captains either had or never developed. On the night of the 13th of October in U-47, he did something that the British had believed was impossible. He threaded his boat through the narrow, half-blocked entrance to Scapa Flow, the great Royal Navy anchorage in the Orkney Islands, navigating between sunken block ships in the dark, on the surface, against the tide, and slipped into the inner harbour where the British Home Fleet rode at anchor. Inside, he found HMS Royal Oak, a battleship of the previous generation, peacefully sleeping. He fired a spread of torpedoes. The first attack was indecisive. Most captains would have run. Priam reloaded, lined up again, and fired a second salvo. The Royal Oak rolled over and sank in 13 minutes. 833 British sailors died, and Priam somehow slipped back out of Scapa Flow undetected into the open North Sea and brought U-47 home. When he docked at Wilhelmshaven, Hitler sent his personal aircraft to bring Priam and his crew to Berlin. Priam received the Knight's Cross from the Führer's own hand. He became, overnight, the Bull of Scapa Flow. His face was on every newspaper. School children learned his name. He was the proof, the regime said, that one bold German boy in a small steel boat could humble the greatest navy in the world. And so the cult of the aces was born. The aces, Ass, the men whose tonnage scores were posted like sports statistics. Otto Kretschmer, slight, quiet, almost shy, who would become the highest-scoring submarine captain of the entire war, sinking 47 ships, totaling more than 270,000 tons before his career ended. Kretschmer earned the nickname Silent Otto, not because he was a calm man, though he was, but because he had developed a tactic so audacious that it required absolute surgical silence. He would slip his U-boat right into the middle of a convoy at night, on the surface, between the columns of merchant ships where the escorts could not see him because the escorts were looking outward, not inward, and where he could fire single torpedoes with deliberate aim, one ship at a time, picking them off like a man at a shooting gallery. Then there was Joachim Schepke, dashing, blonde, photogenic, in a way the propaganda ministry adored. Schepke loved the cameras, gave interviews, posed for portraits. He was an excellent submarine captain and an even better celebrity. Wolfgang Luth, the long-distance specialist, who would patrol off Africa and into the Indian Ocean for 200 days at a stretch. The kind of endurance that wears a crew down to the bone, but produces a kind of strange family among the survivors. Erich Topp, who carried the Red Devil emblem on his conning tower. Reinhard Hardigan. Engelbert Endras, who had been Priam's first watch officer at Scapa Flow and now had his own boat. These names were household words in 1940 Germany. Boys cut their pictures out of magazines and pinned them above their beds, and the rituals of return became sacred. When a U-boat slid back into Lorient, or Saint-Nazaire, or Brest, or La Pallice, or Bordeaux after weeks at sea, a small ceremony unfolded that survivors describe with a kind of aching nostalgia. The boat would creep up the river or into the harbour in the early morning. The men crowded onto the deck and conning tower in their stained leather coats and weeks-long beards. From the periscope flew a long string of small white pennants, one for each ship sunk, fluttering in the breeze. A military band waited on the quay, playing slow marches. There were flowers, often handed up by French girls who had decided, for a complicated mix of reasons, to be friendly to the German Navy. There were nurses, there were photographers, and sometimes standing at the head of the welcoming party was Karl Dönitz himself, the lion, Uncle Karl, who had insisted on personally greeting his men whenever he could. Dönitz would walk down the line, shake every hand, look every man in the eye, ask after the wounded, remember names from previous patrols. It was not theatre. It was the foundation of the loyalty that bound the U-boat arm together, even when, Later, the loyalty would be the only thing left to bind them. And then came the leave. The patrol cycle was simple: 4 to 8 weeks at sea, 4 to 6 weeks in port. After a long patrol, the men were sent to rest hotels along the Brittany coast, places like the Hotel Beau Séjour in Lorient, or the U-boot Weide outside Karnak, where they ate 3 full meals a day, drank French wine, played soccer in the gardens, and tried, sometimes successfully, to forget the boat for a few weeks. Officers got passes to Paris. Other men took the train inland to see their families in Hamburg or Bremen or Munich. They were paid double, fed special rations, given the white-topped cap that was the unmistakable mark of the U-boat man, and treated, briefly, like the heroes the regime was working very hard to make them. Now, meanwhile, 2,000 kilometers to the east, in a quiet villa called Carnival, just outside Lorient, Karl Dönitz sat at his desk and ran the entire war. The headquarters had a great chart of the Atlantic that filled an entire wall, dotted with small flags marking every U-boat at sea, every reported convoy, every air patrol. From this room, Dönitz directed his Rudeltaktik, his Wolfpack tactics, the doctrine he had been refining since the early 30s. The idea was elegantly cruel. A line of U-boats was strung across the convoy routes, hundreds of miles apart like a fishing net. The first boat to spot a convoy did not attack. It became the Fühlungshalter, the contact keeper, the shadower. It stayed just over the horizon, masts and conning tower only briefly visible, sending coded radio reports back to Carnival every few hours. Dönitz, looking at his great map, would calculate the convoy's likely course and order other boats to converge. They would steam, sometimes for 2 days, to a rendezvous point ahead of the convoy. And then, on a moonless night, they would attack together on the surface, where their low silhouettes were nearly invisible and where their diesel engines were faster than the British corvette escorts. The classic catastrophe was Convoy SC-7 in October of 1940. 35 slow merchant ships, lightly escorted, plodding eastward across the Atlantic toward Britain with cargoes of timber, grain, and steel. 5 U-boats found them: Kretschmer, Prien, Schepke, Endras, and Frauenheim. Over 2 nights they tore the convoy apart. 20 of the 35 ships went to the bottom. The escorts, overwhelmed, fired starshells uselessly into a sea where the U-boats were already inside the formation. And then, before the British could even regroup, Convoy HX-79 arrived at the same rendezvous, and the Wolfpack, still topped up with torpedoes from a supply boat, hit them too. 12 more ships lost. The men of the U-boat arm called it the Night of the Long Knives at Sea. Then, in January of 1942, came the second happy time on the other side of the Atlantic. The United States had just entered the war, and the American East Coast was, almost incomprehensibly, completely unprepared. The cities were still lit. Times Square glowed. The lighthouses at Hatteras still rotated their beams. Tankers and freighters steamed up and down the coast on their normal peacetime schedules, silhouetted against the bright shorelights, like targets in a shooting gallery. Dönitz sent 5 Type IX boats. The operation was called Paukenschlag, drumbeat. Reinhard Hardigan, in U-123, surfaced one night so close to New York that he could see, with his own eyes, the lights of Manhattan glittering on the horizon. He stood on the bridge of his U-boat off the coast of New Jersey in 1942 and looked at the lights of an unsuspecting city. Then he turned, found a tanker, and sank it. Between January and July of 1942, German U-boats sank around 600 Allied ships off the American coast and in the Caribbean. The water off Cape Hatteras became known as Torpedo Junction. Bodies and oil washed up on the beaches of Florida. American tourists saw their first burning tanker from their hotel windows. The happy time had crossed the ocean. But, and here the story turns, even at the height of the happy time, the seeds of catastrophe were already planted. In March of 1941, in a single terrible week in the North Atlantic, the U-boat arm lost 3 of its biggest stars. Gunther Prien, the bull of Scapa Flow, vanished with U-47 on the 7th of March, lost to causes that have never been fully explained. A few nights later, on the 17th, Joachim Schepke's boat, U-100, was caught on the surface by HMS Vanoc, which rammed him at full speed. Schepke was crushed against the periscope as the destroyer's bow tore through his conning tower. Almost in the same hour, in the same small patch of ocean, Otto Kretschmer's U-99 was forced to the surface, scuttled by her crew, and Silent Otto was fished out of the freezing water and taken into British captivity for the rest of the war. 3 top aces in 1 week. Prien dead, Schepke dead, Kretschmer captured. Dönitz, when the news reached Carnival, is said to have sat for a long time without speaking. The happy time was still going, on paper. The tonnage was still going up. The propaganda films were still rolling. But somewhere in his quiet, careful, grandfatherly mind, the lion already knew. Something had begun to shift in the cold black water of the Atlantic, and the men in their long steel tubes were about to discover, one boat at a time, what it really meant to be hunted. So let us follow them out there, into that cold black water, and see what the hunt actually felt like, from inside the steel tube in the long days and long nights of an Atlantic patrol. Because the truth is that combat, real combat, was a small, vivid bead on a very long thread of nothing. A patrol of 6 or 7 weeks might contain only 1 or 2 attacks. The rest was sea. Empty, grey, indifferent sea. Day after day of the same horizon, the same swells, the same diesels hammering, the same 4 men on the bridge scanning the same 4 sectors with the same Zeiss 7x50 binoculars, until their eyes ached and the sea seemed to pulse like something living. Below decks, the off-watch played scat at the folding table in the bow compartment, slapping cards down on the wood, arguing softly about who owed whom a cigarette. Someone read a Karl May Western for the 4th time. Someone wrote a letter to a girl he had not seen in a year, knowing the letter would not be mailed for another month. The cook stirred a pot. The hydrophone operator, headphones clamped to his ears, listened to the long, slow, watery silence of the open ocean and heard nothing but his own pulse and, occasionally, the distant, mournful song of a whale. This was patrol. Most of it was this. And then, somewhere around the 18th or 24th or 31st day, when boredom had settled into the bones like damp, someone on the bridge would suddenly stiffen, lift his binoculars, and shout the word that changed everything. Rauchwolke, smoke cloud. The boat transformed in seconds. The captain came up the ladder in 3 pulls. The navigator unrolled his charts. The diesels were ordered to full power, and the bow began to plough white water. Somewhere over the horizon, a smudge of coal smoke betrayed a convoy that did not yet know it had been seen. The U-boat would race ahead on the surface, an end-around chase, sometimes for a full day, gradually pulling parallel to the convoy's course while staying just below the horizon. Only the conning tower and the heads of the lookouts showed against the sky, and from a merchant ship's deck 15 kilometers away, that was nothing at all. Meanwhile, the radio operator was tapping out a contact report to Carnival, where Dönitz, looking at his great chart, was already ordering other boats to converge. The wolves were gathering. Then came the wait. The slow, patient shadow phase. Darkness was the U-boat's friend, and so the captain waited for it the way a wolf waits for the moon. When night fell, he would trim the boat down so that only the conning tower stood above the water, a low, dark shape barely distinguishable from a swell, and he would slip in. Now picture this carefully, because this was the moment Otto Kretschmer made into an art form. The U-boat slides between the outer escorts, who are pinging their sonar outward into the dark, looking for submerged threats. The U-boat is not submerged. The U-boat is on the surface between the columns of merchant ships, close enough to hear voices on the decks, close enough to smell coal smoke and frying onions from the galley of a Liberty ship. The captain stands on the bridge with the UZO, the Überwasserzieloptik, the surface-bearing finder, a stout pair of binoculars mounted on a pillar. He calls out his firing data in a low, even voice. Bearing, range, angle on the bow, estimated speed. The first watch officer, half a meter below him in the conning tower, dials the values into the Vorhalt-Rechner, the torpedo data computer, a clattering electromechanical brain that automatically updates the gyro angles on the torpedoes still sitting in their tubes. And then, very softly, the captain says, "Rohr 1, loss. Tube 1, fire." There is a slight shudder, a hiss of compressed air. A bubble of release rolls up from the bow, and somewhere in the black water a torpedo is now running. You count the seconds in your head. The torpedo runs at 30 knots, or 40 for the steam-driven ones, and you know roughly how long it should take. 20 seconds, 30, 40. And then, on the horizon, a soft orange flash, silent at first, followed by a long delayed thump that reaches you across the water like a giant slamming a door in a distant room. A column of flame climbs into the sky. A tanker full of aviation fuel is no longer a ship. The men on the bridge cheer briefly, the way men do when they have done the thing they trained to do. And then, almost in the same breath, the captain orders the dive, and the U-boat slips beneath the surface and away. About the torpedoes themselves, a small word. There were two main types in the early war. The G7A, steam-driven, fast and reliable, but leaving a clear trail of bubbles a sharp lookout could spot. And the G7E, electric, wakeless, slower but invisible, the preferred weapon for night surface attacks. Both ran on either contact or magnetic pistols, and in 1940 the magnetic ones were a disaster. During the Norwegian campaign, U-boat captains watched their torpedoes pass harmlessly under British battleships, including HMS Warspite, without exploding. The crisis became known as the torpedo craze, the torpedo crisis, and shattered the morale of crews who had risked their lives to make a perfect shot, only to hear nothing at all. Later in the war came cleverer weapons. The Fatih pattern-running torpedo, which would zigzag through a convoy until it hit something. And in August of 1943, the T5 Zaunkönig, the Wren, an acoustic homing torpedo designed to swim toward the propeller noise of an escort destroyer, a desperate weapon for desperately hunted boats. But now the picture flips. Now you are not the hunter. Now you are the hunted. Because somewhere on the dark horizon, the escort has heard your torpedoes, seen the flash, found your scent. And the first thing you hear, deep inside the boat, with all the men frozen at their stations, is a sound that anyone who survived a war patrol described in the same words for the rest of their lives. A high, ringing, metallic ping, pling, through the hull, like the tone of a tuning fork struck against the inside of your skull. That ping was ASDIC, the British sonar, and it meant a destroyer had a fix on you. The captain's voice is calm now, professionally calm, the voice you would want to hear in a burning building. Silent running, Schleichfahrt. The order ripples through the boat in whispers. The diesels are already shut down. The electric motors are reduced to a creep. All non-essential equipment goes off. The ventilation fans stop. Men stop talking. Tools are not set down on metal surfaces. They are placed gently on rags. Even the cook in the galley stands very still and stares at the deckhead. The boat goes deep. 100 meters. 150. 200. The test depth on a Type VII C is officially around 220 meters, but in extremis, crews took their boats to 250, 270, deeper than the engineers had ever truly intended. The hull begins to talk. It creaks, it groans. Paint flakes off the bulkheads in slow white showers. Rivets weep small, perfect tears of seawater. Wooden deck planks pop under the pressure. The boat is being squeezed by an entire ocean. And then, above you, the canisters splash. You can hear them. The men in the bow torpedo room, with their ears closest to the hull, hear them best. Several small, distinct splashes, one after another, as a destroyer rolls its depth charges off the stern racks and fires more from its side throwers. There is a long, terrible pause while they sink. The depth charges are set to detonate at a chosen depth, and you do not know which depth they have chosen. Everyone is counting in their head. And then, the hammer. A depth charge does not really sound like a bomb. It is more like being inside a great steel bell that someone has struck very hard with a sledgehammer. The boat lurches sideways. Light bulbs shatter and the compartment goes briefly black before the emergency lamps flick on. Glass dial faces craze and break. Men are flung from their feet against pipes and lockers. Water sprays through compromised gaskets. Fine, hissing jets that the chief engineer's men race to clamp, and then another, and another. Sometimes they came in patterns of 5, sometimes 10, sometimes for hour after hour, while the destroyer above plodded back and forth, pinging, listening, dropping more. Inside the boat, men did what people do. They prayed quietly. They wept quietly. They gripped the nearest pipe with white knuckles and stared at a single rivet and willed it not to fail. The captain stood in the Zentral with his hands behind his back, and, in the testimony of survivor after survivor, the captain's calm was the thing that kept 50 men from breaking. The Leitender Ingenieur, the chief engineer, the LI, played the trim tanks like a piano, adjusting ballast to hold the boat steady at depth, fighting flooding with rags and wooden plugs and improvised wedges. There is no glamour in this part, only the metal taste of fear in the mouth and the smell of sweat thickening in the dim red light and the slow ticking of the boat's clock. And then there was the air. After 18 hours submerged, the carbon dioxide began to climb. After 24 hours, men's heads ached behind the eyes. After 30 hours, the light bulbs dimmed because the batteries were sagging. Breathing was shallow. Every motion took twice the effort, and a strange, slow-motion stupidity crept into the crew. They opened the calipatronen, the potash cartridges, and passed out small breathing masks that scrubbed the air, but the cartridges were finite. After 36 or 48 hours, the boat had to surface. There was no choice. To stay down was to die slowly. To go up was to risk dying quickly. So, in the small hours of the morning, when the destroyer's pings had finally faded, the captain gave the order. Auftauchen, surface. The blow valves opened. Compressed air screamed into the ballast tanks. The boat tilted upward, climbed slowly, and broke the surface. The bridge hatch was flung open with a clang, and the duty officer scrambled up the ladder, and the rush of clean, cold, salt Atlantic air poured down through the conning tower into a boat full of men who had been buried alive. Survivors all described the same thing. A kind of religious ecstasy. Men weeping, not from fear, but from the simple, astonishing fact of breathing. The first cigarette tasted like communion. The first cup of real coffee, brewed strong and bitter by the cook in his closet of a galley, tasted like a memory of being a child. And then the captain, very quietly, would order a course away from the convoy lane, and the boat would limp home through the long swell, leaving behind a thin, glassy slick of leaked diesel oil on the surface of the sea, the only sign that anything had happened at all. And in their bunks, still in their damp clothes, the men slept the deep, dazed sleep of people who had, by some grace they did not understand, been given one more night. Most of them did not know yet that the rules of that grace were already changing. Most of them did not know yet that the rules of that grace were already changing. But somewhere in a long brick building outside, the village of Bletchley, in a cluster of hut rooms where young women in cardigans worked alongside chess masters and crossword puzzlers, the shape of the war was quietly being rewritten. And somewhere in a research laboratory in Birmingham, a group of physicists had taken a small copper block, cut precise cavities into it, and built something they called a cavity magnetron, a device the size of a teacup that could generate radar pulses on a wavelength so short the Germans had not even imagined it was possible. The U-boat men, eating their stale bread and counting their torpedoes, did not know any of this yet. But the ocean was about to turn against them in ways they had no names for. Let us set the strategic stage gently. By the late winter of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached the very edge of crisis. The wolf packs were larger than ever. There were now well over 200 operational U-boats, with more launching every month. And Dönitz could finally throw 30 or 40 boats at a single convoy. In mid-March of that year, 2 eastbound convoys, the slow SC-122 and the fast HX-229, were caught and savaged in the mid-Atlantic by a wolf pack drawn from a line of 38 U-boats. Over the course of several long, grey, terrible days, 22 merchant ships went down for the loss of only 1 U-boat. It was the largest convoy battle of the entire war, and inside the British Admiralty, the staff officers wrote internal assessments so gloomy that for a brief, vertiginous moment, it appeared that the Allies might genuinely lose the supply line to Britain, lose the Atlantic, and Britain starves. Starve Britain, and there is no D-Day. There is no liberation. There is no end to the war that does not end on German terms. That was March. By the end of May, the entire picture had inverted. In 10 weeks, the U-boat arm went from triumph to ruin. And it happened not because of any single weapon, but because half a dozen different Allied advances all matured at exactly the same time and arrived together like a tide. Take them one at a time, slowly. First, high-frequency direction finding, what the sailors called huff-duff. The U-boats had to talk. Dönitz's whole Wolfpack system depended on radio. The Shadower had to send contact reports. Boats had to acknowledge orders from headquarters. Every transmission was a whisper of the Wolf's location, and now every escort group had ships fitted with rotating antennas that could triangulate the source of those transmissions in seconds. A U-boat sending a single short message could find a destroyer racing toward its position before the captain had finished his coffee. Second, centimetric radar. The earlier metric wave radars had been detectable by the German Metox warning receiver, a clever little device that beeped when enemy radars swept the boat. The new Type 271 shipborne radar, and especially the airborne ASV Mark III carried by Coastal Command Liberators and Sunderlands, used the magic 10-centimeter wavelength produced by that little cavity magnetron, and Metox could not hear it at all. The U-boat captain surfaced at night to charge his batteries, believed he was invisible. He was not. An aircraft was already gliding down on him from a black sky, with its engines throttled back to a whisper. Third, the closing of the air gap. For 2 years, there had been a wedge of mid-Atlantic, several hundred miles wide, where no land-based aircraft could reach. The U-boats called it the Black Pit, and they hunted there in safety. In the spring of 1943, very long-range B-24 Liberators began flying from Iceland, from Newfoundland, from Northern Ireland, and they closed the gap. Suddenly, there was no patch of ocean where a U-boat could surface in daylight without an aircraft potentially dropping out of the clouds within minutes. Fourth, escort carriers. Small, slow, ungainly ships, often built on merchant hulls, sailing in the middle of the convoy with a few Avengers and Wildcats on their decks. They could not have stood up to a real warship, but they did not need to. They needed only to put aircraft above the convoy at all hours, and they did. Fifth, the Hedgehog, a spigot mortar mounted on the foredeck of an escort that fired 24 small contact-fused bombs in a circular pattern ahead of the ship, unlike depth charges, which had to be set to detonate at a guess depth and which broke. Sonar contact when the destroyer ran over the U-boat. The Hedgehog kept the destroyer's sonar locked on the target throughout the attack and only exploded if it actually hit something. Sixth, the lee light. Picture this small horror from the U-boat man's point of view. You are surfaced at 3 in the morning, charging your batteries, the wind cold on your face, your bridge watch sweeping the horizon with binoculars. You hear the faint, growing sound of aircraft engines. Before you can react, an enormous searchlight mounted under the wing of a Wellington bomber a mile away snaps on, and you and your boat are suddenly bathed in white daylight at 3 a.m., and the depth charges are already falling. And then, beneath all of this, like a quiet bass note, there was the code-breaking war. The men at Bletchley Park, working under Alan Turing and Hugh Alexander and others, had been picking away at the naval enigma since the start of the war. They had been helped along by extraordinary luck and extraordinary courage. In May of 1941, U-110, commanded once again by Fritz Julius Lemp, the same man who had sunk the Athenia, was forced to the surface and abandoned without proper scuttling. Lemp drowned, and a British boarding party from HMS Bulldog clambered aboard and stripped the boat of its Enigma machine and codebooks before she sank. In October of 1942, an even more harrowing capture occurred when U-559 was disabled in the Mediterranean. Two young British sailors, Lieutenant Tony Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier, climbed down into the flooding U-boat to retrieve her code documents. They handed the papers up to a 16-year-old galley boy who scrambled them topside, and then both Fasson and Grazier went down with the boat. They drowned quietly inside her, and the documents they died for kept Bletchley reading German naval traffic for the rest of the war. The Germans were not stupid. In February of 1942, they introduced a new four-rotor naval Enigma, the M4, which blacked out British intelligence on Atlantic U-boats for almost the entire year and contributed directly to the carnage of 1942. But in December of 1942, Bletchley broke back in, and from then on they read the Wolfpack's mail. By the spring of 1943, every time Dönitz directed a Wolfpack toward a convoy, the Admiralty often knew the order before some of the U-boat captains did. Convoys were rerouted around Wolfpack lines. Air patrols were directed precisely to where U-boats were known to be. The hunters were being herded. The German technical response, when it came, was brave and inventive, and mostly too late. The Naxos receiver was developed to detect centimetric radar, but by the time it was widely fitted, the Allies had already moved to even shorter wavelengths. The boats had small platforms welded behind the conning tower, called the Winter Garden, fitted with twin and quadruple anti-aircraft guns in a doomed attempt to fight it out on the surface. The Aphrodite, a small balloon trailing strips of foil, was deployed as a radar decoy. The Bold, a chemical pellet that fizzed underwater, was used to confuse sonar. The hydrogen peroxide Walter engine was promised, but never made it to operational service. And the revolutionary Type 21 and Type 23 electrobooter, of which we will speak more later, was still being built when the war ended. And then came Black May of 1943. In a single month, 41 U-boats were sunk. About 1 in 4 of every operational boat at sea, for the loss of only 34 Allied merchant ships, a ratio that, in the cold language of staff officers, was simply unsustainable. The U-boat men were dying faster than the shipyards could replace them, and they were dying without sinking enough to matter. On the 24th of May, 1943, Karl Dönitz did the most painful thing of his career. He withdrew his boats from the North Atlantic convoy lanes. In his diary, he wrote, with stubborn honesty, that they had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. 5 days earlier, on the 19th of May, U-954 had been sunk south of Greenland by escorts from convoy on 184. Among the dead aboard her was Oberleutnant zur See Peter Dönitz, 21 years old, the Admiral's younger son. The Admiral received the telegram at his headquarters and went on with his work. A year later, in May of 1944, his older son Klaus would also be killed, lost in a torpedo boat raid against the English coast. 2 sons, both gone. Whatever else one feels about Karl Dönitz, and there is much to feel, the man received the same telegrams that the families of his crews received. He understood the price. Now picture the war from inside a Type VII C in this new world. You take off after a long leave, perhaps after a year ashore in training command. You step aboard a boat that looks much the same as the one you left. The men beside you are younger, less experienced, more frightened. You sail, and within hours you discover that the rules have changed entirely. You cannot run on the surface in daylight because aircraft drop on you within minutes. You cannot run on the surface at night because radar finds you. You cannot transmit because Huff Duff hears you. You cannot dive because the new sonars hold you. The tactics that earned the aces their oak leaves a year ago are now suicide, and the boats simply began to disappear. Not gloriously, not in great battles. They left port and they did not come back. The radio went silent. The expected position reports never came. And in time, a telegram arrived at a small house in Bremen or Hamburg or Kiel with a single word: vermisst, missing. It was the kind of word that meant the boat was almost certainly crushed beyond recognition, 2 miles down on the floor of the Atlantic, with all hands still inside her, and would never be found. Some boats were captured. U-175 was sunk by the United States Coast Guard cutter Spencer in April of 1943, with surviving crew picked up by the same ship that had killed her. And in one of the most extraordinary episodes of the entire naval war, on the 4th of June 1944, 2 days before D-Day, a small American hunter-killer task group under Captain Daniel Gallery surprised U-505 off the coast of West Africa, forced her to the surface with depth charges, and put a boarding party aboard her before she could be scuttled. They captured her intact. Codebooks, Enigma machine, the lot. It was the first warship boarded and captured at sea by the United States Navy since 1815. U-505 was towed in secret to Bermuda, kept hidden for the rest of the war so the Germans would not know what had been taken. And today she sits, beautifully restored, inside the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, where school children on field trips file through her narrow passages and try, briefly, to imagine what it was like to live there. The men in their bunks in the autumn of 1943 knew none of these futures. They only knew the casualty lists, growing longer at the briefing room and the empty chairs in the mess hall, and Dönitz's exhortations to fight on with new weapons, new tactics, new courage. They knew, in the quiet way men know such things, that the white cap they had once volunteered for so eagerly was now, in plain mathematics, a death sentence. And they sailed anyway, because that was what they had been trained to do, and because their friends were sailing, and because, somehow, when there is nothing else left, men still go. And so we come to the last act of this long, sad story. The autumn of 1943 slid into the winter of 1944, and the U-boat arm, bleeding to death, somehow refused to die. Dönitz, now Grand Admiral of the entire Kriegsmarine, after replacing Raeder in January of 1943, remained convinced that new technology could pull the war back from the edge. He was wrong, and he probably knew he was wrong, but he had 30,000 young men still trusting him, and he had no other answer to give them. The first new technology was old, actually. The snorkel, was originally a Dutch invention from the 1930s, a hollow tube with a clever float valve at the top that allowed a submarine to run her diesels at periscope depth without surfacing. The Germans had captured working examples when they overran the Netherlands in 1940, but had not bothered to fit them, because in 1940 the U-boats owned the surface and did not need to hide beneath it. By 1944, they very much needed to hide. So the snorkel was hastily retrofitted to Type VII and Type IX boats, and an entire generation of new submariners learned to live underneath one. Living underneath one was, by every account, a small kind of hell. The float valve at the top of the tube was designed to slam shut whenever a wave washed over it, to keep seawater from pouring into the diesels. In any kind of swell, this happened constantly, sometimes every few seconds. Each time the valve slammed shut, the diesels, still hungrily sucking air, would suddenly find none coming down the tube, and would instead suck the air directly out of the boat itself. Eardrums popped, men's ears bled, pressure changes hammered through their sinuses. And then, equally horribly, when the diesels exhausted, the exhaust gases sometimes blew back down into the boat, filling the compartments with a choking, oily fog. You could not raise the snorkel head without producing a small white feather of wake on the surface, perfectly visible to centimetric radar from a Liberator 20 miles away. So the snorkel saved you from being seen on the surface and exposed you to being seen at periscope depth, and broke your eardrums and gassed your crew, and it was, even so, the best thing they had. The second new technology was the Type 21 electroboot. And here, just for a moment, the German engineers produced something genuinely revolutionary. The Type 21 was not a submarine that could submerge. It was a true submarine, the first in history, a vessel actually designed to live and fight beneath the surface rather than on top of it. She displaced 1,621 tons submerged. She carried massive battery banks that gave her a top underwater speed of 17 knots, faster than most Allied escorts. She had a streamlined hydrodynamic hull, a passive sonar array sensitive enough to attack without ever raising a periscope, hydraulic torpedo reloading that let her fire 18 torpedoes in 20 minutes, and, almost as a kind of cruel joke given the years of suffering that had preceded her, a freshwater shower for the crew. A shower. Imagine telling a Type VII C veteran of 1942 that the next generation of boat would have a shower. He would have laughed until he cried. Only two Type 21s, U-2511 and U-3008, ever made operational war patrols. Both sailed in the final weeks of the war. U-2511, under Adalbert Schnee, an old ace from the happy time, conducted a famous mock attack on a British cruiser on the eve of the surrender, gliding silently beneath her escort screen and pulling away again undetected. The captain wrote in his log that with this boat, in 1942, they could have won the war. The smaller Type 23 coastal version, designed for the North Sea, made a few patrols too. None of it mattered. They came too late, and there were too few of them, and the war was already over. In the meantime, the old boats fought on and died. When D-Day came on the 6th of June 1944, Dönitz committed 36 U-boats to the Channel to stop the invasion fleet. 15 of them never came home. The boats that survived achieved almost nothing against the most heavily protected stretch of water in the history of war. The dying continued, quietly, in scattered places. U-864, on the 9th of February 1945, was carrying mercury and aircraft parts to Japan when she was intercepted off Norway by the British submarine HMS Venturer. In the only confirmed kill in history of one submerged submarine by another, Venturer's captain calculated a three-dimensional firing solution by ear and sonar alone and put a torpedo through her. There were no survivors. U-869, in February of that same year, was lost off the New Jersey coast, sunk by her own circling torpedo, although nobody knew that at the time. she vanished from the records until in 1991, a small group of recreational divers off New Jersey found a submarine on the seabed where no submarine was supposed to be, and slowly, dive by dive, identified her. The story would later be told in a book called Shadow Divers, and 3 sailors would die in the process of identifying the dead boys still inside her. The end came in pieces. In the freezing Baltic on the 30th of January, 1945, the Soviet submarine S-13 under Alexander Marinesko torpedoed the German liner Wilhelm Gustloff, which was carrying refugees and wounded soldiers fleeing the Red Army. Around 9,000 people died in the icy water that night, in what remains the worst single maritime disaster in history. 2.5 months later, on the 16th of April, the Goya was torpedoed by another Soviet submarine, and another 6,000 or 7,000 souls went into the Baltic. The submarine war, which had begun with German torpedoes sinking the Athenia and her civilian passengers, ended with Soviet torpedoes sinking the Gustloff and the Goya and theirs. The wheel had come fully around. On the 30th of April 1945, in his bunker beneath Berlin, Adolf Hitler shot himself, and in his political testament, he named Karl Dönitz, of all people, as his successor. Not Goering, who had betrayed him. Not Himmler, who had betrayed him. The submarine man who had gone on quietly doing his job. Dönitz set up his rump government at the Naval Academy at Flensburg-Moorvik, the same buildings where so many of his young captains had been trained, and from there, on the 4th of May, 1945, he transmitted to his fleet the code word Regenbogen, rainbow, the order to surrender. Many of his captains ignored the order, whether out of pride or shame or stubborn refusal to hand their boats over to anyone. They instead opened the seacocks and scuttled their own vessels in the harbours and fjords of northern Germany, watching from the quayside as their steel homes settled quietly to the bottom. The boats that did surrender were taken into Allied custody, and in late 1945 and early 1946, the Royal Navy carried out Operation Deadlight, towing 116 surrendered U-boats out into deep water off Northern Ireland and sinking them with gunfire and torpedoes and aerial bombs, one by one, until they were gone. 2 boats refused to give up. U-530 and U-977, both at sea when the surrender came, sailed all the way to Argentina and gave themselves up there, U-530 in early July, U-977 in mid-August. Their long, lonely voyages and their late surrenders in a neutral country would feed decades of conspiracy theories about Nazi escapes and submarine treasure, none of which ever held up to serious scrutiny, and all of which are far less interesting than the real story of 2 crews who simply could not bear to come home. Karl Dönitz himself was put on trial at Nuremberg. He was charged, among other things, with waging aggressive war and with violations of the laws of submarine warfare. The submarine warfare charge was a delicate one because the United States, through Admiral Chester Nimitz, had conducted a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare in the Pacific that was identical in every important respect to what Dönitz had done in the Atlantic. Nimitz himself sent a deposition acknowledging this, and the tribunal, somewhat embarrassed, declined to assess any sentence on the submarine warfare counts alone. Dönitz received 10 years. He served them in Spandau prison, alongside Hess and Speer and Schirach and the other surviving senior Nazis, and was released in 1956. He spent the rest of his life in a small house in Schleswig-Holstein, writing memoirs and quietly insisting that he had only done his duty, and he died in 1980. His men, the ones who had survived, came home to a Germany that was rubble. Many were prisoners of war for years. The British camps, the Canadian camps, the American camps were grim but survivable. The Soviet camps were something else entirely, and a number of U-boat men were not released by the Soviets until 1955 or 1956, 10 years after the war had ended. They came back to find wives remarried, parents dead, cities they did not recognize, and a country that did not particularly want to talk about what they had done or what had been done to them. They did what veterans always do. They formed an association, the Verband Deutscher U-Bootfahrer, and they met quietly each year to remember their friends. They gathered at Multenort near Kiel, where a long curved memorial holds the names of nearly 30,000 U-boat men, panel after panel after panel, surnames and ranks and boat numbers stretching on for what feels like forever. If you visit, the gulls cry overhead, and the Baltic glints in the distance, and the names go on and on and on. In 1973, a former war correspondent named Lothar Gunther Buchheim, who had sailed on a real Atlantic, patrol aboard U-96, in the autumn of 1941, published a novel called Das Boot. It was based on what he had seen and on the men he had known, almost all of whom were dead. In 1981, Wolfgang Petersen made it into a film, and somehow, against all odds, the film became one of the greatest war films ever made, in any language, anywhere. Critics in countries that had been bombed by these very U-boats came out of theatres quietly shaken because Petersen had refused to make the men either heroes or monsters, and had instead made them what they had actually been, which was young. The grey wolves are gone now. Their boats are scattered across the floor of the Atlantic, slowly rusting into the seabed, their hulls home to fish and crabs and the occasional curious diver. The men who sailed in them are nearly all gone too, the last veterans dying in their 90s in quiet German hospital rooms, mostly without fanfare. What remains is a story, and the story is one of the most extraordinary and one of the saddest in the long history of human beings going to sea. So let us pull back, slowly, and look at them from a long way off. They were, almost all of them, very young. Boys from Hamburg tenements and Bavarian farms and the narrow streets of Bremen. Boys who had volunteered for the white cap and the double pay and the glamour, and who found themselves instead living for weeks at a time inside a damp steel pipe that smelled of diesel and old socks. They were stubborn in the way that young men in uniform have always been stubborn. Stubborn about their boat, stubborn about their captain, stubborn about not letting their watchmates down. They learned to sleep in another man's sweat, to eat bread furred with mould, to laugh at jokes about coffins, and to keep watch in freezing spray for 4 hours at a time without complaint. They wrote letters to mothers they would never see again. They fell in love with photographs taped above their bunks, and they died, 3 out of every 4 of them, in the cold dark of an ocean that did not care who they were or what flag they served. Their competence was quiet. Their courage was quiet. Their dying, most of all, was quiet, with no last words and no witnesses and no grave anyone could find. They were not, most of them, the architects of anything. They were not the planners of camps or the writers of laws. They were boys who had been handed a uniform and a torpedo and a war, and they did, on the whole, what boys handed those things have always done. They tried to live, and they tried to keep their friends alive, and they tried to come home. Most of them failed at the last part, through no particular failing of their own, and the world they would have come home to was, by the end, already gone. Tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, with your soft pillow and your quiet ceiling, and the gentle hum of a refrigerator somewhere down the hall, maybe spare a quiet thought for a young man in a wet wool sweater on a bridge in the North Atlantic, 80 years ago, scanning the dark for a smoke cloud he hopes he does not see. Spare a thought for the cook in his phone booth galley, trying to make something warm for 50 tired men. Spare a thought for the boy in the forward torpedo room, climbing into a stranger's still warm bunk, pulling the damp blanket up to his chin and closing his eyes against the rivets above him, just as you are closing yours now. Somewhere, far from any harbour, the lights of a small ship are sliding gently over the horizon, and the water behind her is closing without a sound, and the long patrol is over at last. The gulls have gone home. The sea is quiet. There is nothing more to watch for tonight, and nothing more to fear, and nothing more to do but rest. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Let one slow breath go all the way out. The boats are still now. The names are remembered. And you, in your warm bed, are safe. Sleep well.